I've had a comment from Craig, and I wouldn't mind getting your feedback on it, because you both are natural finders and relationship, great interpersonal skills, good with clients. And I'd say over your journey, just like most of the people on the line here, have built quite close relationships with clients, to the extent that some of them, are probably friends. A good few of them are probably friends. So in terms of removing yourself from that work relationship, how have you found that to be with clients who you have a friendship with?
It's really easy. I mean, my biggest client still pays us around 70 or 80,000 a year.
Mm-hmm.
And I still go walking with him every Sunday. And, I say to him, mate, you can ask me anything you want. But the team is so good that he doesn't need to ask me anything. Sometimes he asks me things more about the business, like strategy and that kind of, not tax, because the team's really good on the tax side. They're better than I am.
Yeah.
And he knows that. He knows that they're better than me. So when he asks me tax questions, I don't know the answer. He goes, it's all right, I'll go ask the client manager. But it's a slow process. They've got to get confidence in the client manager that they're dealing with. And don't forget, when you're very small, the only person that client's ever seen is you, right? And often they think that, they're your only client, right? Because you've actually never introduced them to anybody else in your practice. So if you see it from their point of view, they've only ever dealt with you, and in their mind's eye, you've only got one client, that's them. All right. So all of a sudden, if you introduce them to somebody else, then those things that I talked about, like 80% of them will just go to the person you introduce. Like 16% of them will take longer to introduce. You might have to introduce them 4 or 5 or 6 times, and then a handful you'll take 20 times before you go right across. Now, this largest client he was my very first client. And I used to go out there every month, a couple of times a month. And whenever he rang me up, I dropped everything and I drove out there. So I went from doing that, right, to just don't deal with him at all from a tax technical point of view. So it can be done, but you need to build a team around you, get confidence, be patient, be persistent, and lead. You cannot do this unless you lead. You've got to be patient and understand that when someone says, no, I only want to deal with you, they're just saying, give me a bit more time, all right? Give me a bit more time to get used to the client manager that you've introduced me to, and give me a little bit more time to change my habits. That's all they're saying.
Okay. Perfect sense. Jamie, anything to add to that?
Just a couple of practical things. When I was in the transition of handing over the clients to the senior client managers, a couple of things that I would do was, often we've all got mobile phones, and many, many times the client would ring me, and Ed mightn't have done this, I don't know, but I did this for the technology. I'd just say, hang on a minute, I'll merge the call, with Paul. He'll actually know this answer better than me. So we'd often have a 3-way conversation, and Paul would answer it for me with a client. We'd have a discussion. So ripping on the client. So a lot of the time, once they met the senior client manager, I'd often merge the calls. And the same with emails. You get emails from the client, and I would reply to the client and CC, one of the guys, because they'd met them, and say, look, I think this is what you do. What do you think, Paul? And then all of a sudden you've got 3 or 4 or 5 emails. The senior client managers looked better than you. So it's just dripping. Yeah. It's just educating. It's just educating. And just from a practical sense, it just happens. And because people are people, and you build rapport, people just want answers. They want service. And if they're responsive, and we sort of spoke about responsiveness in the last couple of weeks, they just get to know the senior client manager. And doesn't mean you don't have to be friends with them. I've still got the first clients I ever have, and I don't even look after them. But I call them up and say, how's life? Where'd you go for holidays? And it's just not an issue. It just happens. It's a little bit of leap of faith in there too.
Brilliant.
Yeah, and the really big clients, like if you're still working in your practice, you should do the PR work with them. Go to lunch with them, do all the
That's
PR.
what I often do.
That's really important. That's what I call balance sheet stuff. Do the balance sheet stuff, and get the P&L stuff done by the team, but you do the balance sheet stuff. And then that will refer more clients to you, because people are people, and they like relationships, and they'll you. they won't refer work to you unless they like you.
Mm-hmm.
And so do the PR work with them. Don't get stuck in the quad A activities, or what I call the P&L activities. Get stuck in the balance sheet activities, which are all the quad 2 activities.
Yeah.
Okay. We covered this topic actually, Ed, because the response from it was so engaging. I mean, there's quite a few people responding back to that email saying that they really connected with it. And I think at the end of the day, it comes back to this people issue and this topic of leadership. We've been speaking about it between the three of us the last week. I mean, we are all quite interested in the topic of leadership, but I've got a question which I'll kick it off with is how do you get your people interested in becoming better leaders? We've all actively engaged in it on a personal level because we're interested in it and we know we need to become better leaders to be better business owners. But how do we get our teams to recognize that they need to be better leaders?
Knowing your people, right? And sometimes the opposite happens. They want to be a leader, but they're not. You've got to be a leader of leaders and help them. And I use this example when I was straight out of uni, in my apprenticeship, if you like, with a firm, and I won't mention the name, but I'm not a grinder. I'm a minder. I'm more of a manager and a finder. And I was really unhappy because, like all graduates, you've got to do the grinding, right? You've got to, learn the stuff. There's no shortcuts. But I was really unhappy because, not that I struggled with the work, but I just did not enjoy the work. Mm-hmm. So I ended up leaving after a year, and then I'd go to another firm, and then a year later I'd leave, and then I did that 3 or 4 times, and I thought something's wrong with me, because everybody stays there well, at my age, they stay there for a long, long time. I'm talking about 10, 15, 20 years. That's just standard. But what was happening was that if the partner of the first firm understood or was a better leader, he would have sat me down and said, Ed, you're a manager, you're not a grinder, but you've got to do 4 or 5 years of this to get the knowledge, then to be able to manage somebody, because you've got to know what you're talking about if you're managing somebody else. Mm-hmm. So you really need to be patient here and mapped it out for me, help me understand where I am in this thing. And he would have got the management, the leadership out of me. He should have recognized that I was a leader, and he would have kept me. Instead, he didn't help. He didn't understand it himself, let alone his own practice was out of control. Like, he was just working stupid hours, enormous hours, trying to do it by brute force. And he didn't understand this either. So he couldn't help me. So I left. So he lost me, who, if I'd stayed there and he nurtured me to be a leader, I could have done so much for that practice, but he lost me. And unfortunately, leaders have to be leaders and help other leaders. And unfortunately, we don't have that in a lot of firms. And that's my answer to you. Like I'm constantly, helping Cindy here to lead, because she's a practice manager here, for her to understand her team. And as I said, work 80% of the time with her team and 20% of the time with the clients. And most practices work, well, my boss did as well. He worked 80% of his time with the clients, and I hardly ever saw him. Mm. How is he going to help me? He wasn't showing any leadership to me. So that's my answer, Brenton.
Okay, that makes perfect sense.